Hey everybody, this is Jared Marlowe from the Blue and Gray Education Society, and today we're going to do something a little bit different for our channel. We've brought on a ton of experts who are knowledgeable about battles and individuals throughout the Civil War, but today we're going to dive into the world of metal detecting, and I could think of no better guest to bring on for this than my good friend, Mr. Elijah Filbert here. Elijah, how are things going up in Winchester for you?
We're good. I appreciate you having me on. Definitely excited to get into this topic.
Well, if you know Elijah's name, or maybe you've heard his voice before, Elijah is one half of the podcast duo that produces the Battlefields and Bourbon podcast. Elijah and his friend Jack are the ones behind that. And like I said, we're really excited to have Elijah on right now because this is a topic that I've been wanting to know more about, and I imagine a lot of you are interested in it as well. So Elijah, tell us a bit more about you, what got you started metal detecting. What's your interest in the Civil War? Just give us some basic background for you.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, I'm from Winchester, Virginia, so it should come as no surprise that Civil War history is part of who I am, as it is for many people here. Um, it might surprise you that I don't work in history or anything of that nature. Never really pursued it as a career. It's just always been a personal passion of mine. I just grew up around it. My dad got me into it at a really young age, just with metal detecting, following him around as a kid, just kind of trudging through the woods and fields behind him till I was big enough to swing a detector on my own and find my own stuff. And then another part of that too, he shoots competitively with the NSSA, North South Skirmish Association, at Fort Shenandoah here, just outside of Winchester. So that was another thing that kind of got me into Civil War history, is like, seeing these pieces of history fire um, live and in color. So that's another thing that kind of like draws you closer to everything. It's just been something that like I said, I grew up with. And then, once I was old enough to kind of really appreciate it, start not shooting myself, but like shooting at the NSSA as well. And then just kind of, really getting a hands-on approach to it. Detecting myself and just kind of, instead of watching from the sidelines, so to speak, I was kind of getting into it.
All right. And for those who may not know the story of Battlefields and Bourbon, how did you translate your love for the Civil War and your passion, watching from the sidelines into something active? Like what was what's the story behind that?
Well, Jack and I have always kind of had a pretty shared passion for Civil War history. Um, I was more so into the bourbon aspect of things, just being older than him. Um, and then we kind of, it was funny that that actually became a thing because of a metal detector. Like, I sent him a Snapchat of one of my detectors that is a collapsible detector. So it was kind of just all folded up in the kitchen, and I sent him a Snapchat of it, and he was like, "Is that a microphone or something? Or are you starting a podcast?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And he's like, "Is that not a microphone?" I was like, "No, that's my detector." And I was like, "But a podcast is a good idea." And then we just kind of joked about it for a little while. I was like, "Well, this actually might be, a pretty good idea." So we combined the two into what Battlefields and Bourbon is today. Uh, Obviously, if you've listened to an episode, the Civil War history is more so the meat and potatoes of the episodes, just kind of with, a little bit of bourbon refreshment in between. But yeah, just kind of trying to bring two audiences together. Because I mean, most folks that I know that appreciate, a good whiskey also like history, and vice versa. I mean, it's just kind of a, a, a shared community there. And obviously, our hope is that maybe if you don't know so much about one or the other, this podcast helps you kind of, bridge that gap and find an interest in something new.
Yeah, and I can definitely say from experience, it's definitely broadened my palate when it comes to bourbons, and I've definitely consulted with you about stuff that I found, and we've been in the lottery business for a while now, trying to win at least something,
And
um,
we're losers every time.
every single time. But hey, you can't win if you don't play. Uh,
Exactly.
So speaking of metal detecting, what got you started there? Like what, or how long have you been doing it? What's your story with that?
So I started when I was, I want to say like 8 years old. I was in third grade. I remember this so vividly too because just the circumstances surrounding it. Um, my dad, obviously, like I said, my dad always took my brother and I out with him, and we would just follow behind. Never really took an interest in it. We would just go play in the woods while he was, detecting whatever site we were at. Um, but then one day, my brother went to go on like an extended vacation with one of his friends from school. I couldn't go because, being the younger brother, you just don't do that. But I was home and my dad was like, "Hey, do you want to like try this out?" So I was like, "Sure, yeah, just to see." I was like, "I don't know how any of this works, but I'm down to try." Um, so we went out to a an old permission of his that he had had some luck at quite a few times, just a Union cavalry camp. So pretty high likelihood of finding at least something. So I went out there with him and my mom, and first thing I found was a, Union Spencer carbine bullet. So had some of the casing left on it. Like I said, remember that very specifically because I mean you never forget your first. But from that point on, I mean I was hooked, and that's I think anybody that's in this hobby or in this profession, if you're an archaeologist, once you find that first artifact, I mean it's over. You're hooked for life.
So about how often do you go out and do digs or search for things?
Oh man. When I was in high school, I would tell you probably every day. But as you grow up and get older, more things get in the way. Life, family. Not that that's a bad thing because you have to have a healthy balance of everything. But nowadays, on the weekends when I can, and that's just more or less if I don't have, other responsibilities. So I like to say one day out of the weekend, just to get out there and see what I can do, whether it be research, gaining permissions, or actually going out and detecting. I mean, at least trying to dedicate one day to just expanding that.
So as far as like your lead up process, like what's that process like? What do you do as far as, selecting a site and getting permissions and all that?
Yeah, so there's a pretty sometimes there's an extensive process for this. Here recently for me or in the past, I'd say 10 years or so, I've really gotten into, the research side of things. As a kid, I never really considered that aspect. It was always just, go where my dad took me and yeah, there's stuff here, you'll find something without really knowing the why. But nowadays, I mean, looking at battle maps, reading soldiers' diaries, reading official records, and things like that. Um, Finding the private properties that these accounts would have lined up with, and then just asking the landowner for permission, whether that be sending a letter, knocking on their door, if it's a business, giving them a call or an email, anything like that, just to try to make a connection and just kind of presenting yourself in a professional manner. Because at the end of the day, these people are kind enough to allow you on their property to pursue your hobby, and that's one thing that I've always said is like the difficult part of this hobby is that it's dependent on other people. You can have a hobby where if you like to draw, I mean, you can just do that. If you like art, like I said, just do that on your own. Whereas with, metal detecting, you have to rely on somebody else allowing you on their property to do it. Um, but yeah, I mean, there's a whole process to it. Like I said, battle maps, diary entries, official records, that sort of thing. And then there's also just kind of a just get lucky kind of thing. I mean, if you think about a spot um, in terms of practicality, is it near an old road? Is it on a nice, high hill near a water supply, near crossroads? There's a lot of different things to consider. If you're looking for a camp, that's one thing to consider. It's just like your proximity to certain necessities. Um, and a lot of that is just process of elimination. Sometimes you might find a spot that you think, man, this would be perfect. I mean, soldiers would have to be here, and then there's nothing. Or, you get lucky and you find a bunch of stuff. It's just, really hit or miss.
Right. And one thing that you mentioned is something that I've really gotten into with studying like local history is like finding that like those minute details about a certain site or a certain place where you're looking at things where it isn't just, a grand look at a battle map and different movements and stuff. Like you're looking at specific points on like a creek or like a certain elevation or, like where two roads back then may have met. It's that kind of stuff that's fascinating for me. It's a true look back in time of, okay, if I was here 160 years ago, like where's which creek would I have been to? Which water source are they referencing in their record here? So I imagine you do, or you have to compile all that stuff too. And it's to me, it's that's the fascinating part of it.
Yeah, I mean, because think of how often names change for things.
Right.
There's a lot of small little towns and hamlets that were named one thing 160 years ago and are now known by a totally different name. And to try to, cross-reference that and dig through, resources to try to find out, where this town that was once called this, now called this, where that crossover happens to try to pinpoint, you know, where a place is sometimes difficult. Certain, if you're looking for a spring or something that's since dried up, no longer used, I mean, that's a possibility. So the water source that somebody's referencing may no longer exist.
So with all that being said, with your passion for this and your passion for history, what role do you see metal detecting playing in history, both now and going forward?
Oh, it's huge because I mean, especially today, I mean, the Civil War is not getting any younger. So each year goes by, most things are sinking deeper into the ground. Back in the day, like 1950s, 1960s, the pioneers of relic hunting, I mean, they could just walk behind a tractor plowing a field and find this stuff laying on top of the ground. Nowadays, if you find something laying on top of the ground, should consider yourself pretty lucky because that doesn't happen very often anymore. So, I mean, you need the assistance of metal detection technology to be able to locate this stuff. Because otherwise, if you just, you know, go out in the field and just start digging, test holes, the odds of you actually coming across something are very, very slim because sometimes things are very scattered or very concentrated. And if you don't know exactly where to look, you're probably not going to find it. And that's just something that I've always felt, a metal detector is an invaluable resource when you're trying to excavate a site and kind of preserve this stuff. And I mean, metal detectorists, amateur archaeologists, however you want to call them. I mean, it's just an indisputable fact that they've contributed so much to the archaeological record as far as the things that have been found over the years. I mean, I know quite a few detectorists myself that have found, examples of artifacts that, less than 10 have ever been found ever. And it's like things like that that are valuable contributions to, the story of the Civil War because there are pieces of equipment that were so limited produced that, if it weren't for them, we would never know that these things existed.
Right. And it's, going back to that point I talked about earlier, it's really cool to think about, when you find something as small as a bullet or some sort of shell fragment, like this is at one time was held by somebody, back then. Like it to me, like it transports you back to that day and time. Like somebody dropped this coat button, back then, and they didn't think anything of it. But this was part of their uniform that's here in the ground. That's that's pretty awesome just to try to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I mean that's something that always crosses my mind every time I find something is like, wow, I'm the first person to hold this since the guy that lost it. And it's
Right.
it's always cool, especially depending on the item that you find. Um, just how important that would have been to somebody. I mean, if you find a nice coat button that's got like, a ton of gold or silver still on it, and it's like you find that and you think, oh, they probably didn't think anything of it in the heat of battle. But depending on who the officer of your regiment is, if you ever did a uniform inspection and you're missing a button, how big of a deal was that for them in the moment? Could that have been a problem down the line? But it's little things like that that I like to think of. Um, that obviously may not have crossed somebody's mind when their life is on the line. Um, but there are also other parts that are really cool to find too. Like I mean, if you find gun parts and things like that, or fired bullets in certain contexts, if it's at a battle or skirmish, I mean, you think about that when you pick that up. That bullet was fired, with the intent to kill somebody, and it's really just, I mean, while it's one little piece that may often be overlooked, I mean, it's there's a lot behind it when you think about it.
Oh, absolutely. So switching gears a bit here, let's talk about the gear that you use when you're out in the field. Let's start with like what stuff that you started with and what do you use now. So kind of the transition from your first days to now.
So when I started out, I had, and some people that are in the metal detecting community that are watching this will probably know what this is, a Garrett Freedom series. I think it was a Freedom 2. So that's something from, like the 80s or 90s. It's an old detector, but it did great for me for many years until it just stopped working. But that's the nature of old equipment. It will eventually, not work anymore, and when they don't make any more of them, you can't replace it. Um, but yeah, that one did great for me for quite a while. Um, and then there was one I can't remember what it was. It was a Garrett, and it just kind of that was in an intermediate period, and when I was in like middle school, where I didn't go as much, so I didn't use it that often. Really got back into it. Started using a Nautilus DMC2B, which is a another old detector, but again, it did great for me. Found me a lot of great things, and up to modern day now. Uh, Used a variety of different things. The Garrett AT series, the Pro, the Max. Those are good waterproof detectors if you ever look into hunt creeks or rivers or whatever the case may be. Those are good for that. But today I just use the MindLab GPX 5000. That's a mouthful, but it is an incredible detector. It's got a lot to it. There's like a whole little lithium battery that you wear on a backpack, and I mean, it's a high powered detector. They're meant for gold, I'm pretty sure, but they do incredible things for, relic hunting here in the States. But I mean, you can find bullets and artifacts over a foot deep easily. I mean, it's nothing to dig stuff super deep with those detectors, and that's why they're so highly revered, I would say. They're just, the top of the line, but they are expensive. So there is that downside to them. But then I have an XP Deus as well, which is that little collapsible detector that Jack thought was a microphone. And that one's good for, house sites and camps and things like that where there's a lot of iron to pick out like the non-ferrous signals in between like your bullets and lead and that sort of thing, like lead, brass, things like that. That's an incredible detector to try to sift through, dense sites like that. Super lightweight, whereas a GPX kind of makes your shoulder hurt after a little while. But yeah, those two are the bread and butter of the detectors. I use a little handheld Garrett pinpointer, and it just kind of looks like a carrot, about like that. Just turn that on. You've probably seen them at like security for events and that sort of thing. But you just poke around in the dirt with that just to try to find what it is or kind of size up where you're at. And then I use a little hand trowel, like a little gardening trowel, to kind of carve out the dirt when the hole is open. So that just that way you're not going to like run the chance of hitting something with a shovel, which is your other piece of equipment, your shovel, and then just a dump pouch for large items, trash, and then a little hard shell container just to put the bullets and good stuff in.
So do you mark where you find things at so that way there's a record of it, or if you want to come back to that site later, okay, well I found something here last time, I'll go somewhere else near the same site next time.
Yeah, so there is an app called GAIA GPS, and it will track your walking path. So you just turn on your phone, and I mean it's in your pocket, so it tracks your path and marks it on a map. Um, so you can see exactly where you've been. Every time I find something, um, that's a historic item. Obviously, I'm not going to take a picture of trash, but anything that's an artifact, I take a picture of it and it drops a GPS coordinate with a little pin drop on the map of where it came from. So when I look at a site, you can map out, if you're on private property on a a battlefield, I say, or skirmish or anything like that. You can kind of map out battle lines pretty easily with that. It shows like nice distinct lines and that sort of thing. Um, and it's just it's an invaluable resource as far as making sure you cover a site thoroughly, but also marking the things that you have found, so that way their location and context is preserved.
So as with most everything, there are some cardinal rules, some do's, some don'ts, and even maybe some unspoken rules, in your hobby. So what are some cardinal rules that people who are interested in pursuing this need to know, to do, and not to do?
Biggest thing first that I would say is probably just know the laws in your locality as far as what you need to do to metal detect. I mean, because there are, certain local parks and county governments will allow you to do that, others won't. So just make sure you know that you're allowed to be where you are, because otherwise you could find yourself in quite a bit of hot water that you don't want to end up in just for the sake of, pursuing a new hobby. Um, so yeah, know your local laws. Always have permission to where you're going. Nobody likes a trespasser. They ruin it for everybody else. I can't tell you how many times I've gone and asked somebody, and they say, "Well, we've had too many people trespassing here, so we don't allow anybody to go." It's an unfortunate reality, but that's the biggest thing is just don't trespass. Make sure you've got permission. Just do the right thing. Um, and then as far as don'ts, there is a very competitive nature to this hobby for some folks. Um, and some people just aren't very trustworthy, I would say. Not that that's directed at anybody, specifically, but there are folks that will, if you take them to a site just, as a courtesy or just to, bring a friend with you, sometimes they will take that as, license to go back without you. And that's just kind of like with fishing or hunting or anything like that. Don't go back to a spot that somebody else introduced you to without them. That's just, bad etiquette. Um, but that's one of the biggest things. Always close gates behind you if you're at a farm and you're, going between fields or something like that. Always close gates behind you. Leave the place as clean, if not cleaner than you found it. If you find trash, take it out with you. Do the owner a courtesy because they're doing you a courtesy by even letting you on their property. Uh, Make sure, like I said, with the GAIA GPS, that you're tracking hunts um, or finding a different method that works for you to document what you found. Just that way you're preserving the context of it because it's at the end of the day, it's not just, you collecting something for yourself. Like you're contributing to the archaeological and historical record, whether you realize it or not, when you find this stuff. So it's important that, one day when, we all pass on, that this information is preserved for future generations to know, this came from here, and the context behind that. Because, you know, you find something that's like a Western theater artifact and it ends up making its way over to, the East Coast and nobody knows where it came from. Somebody might assume that it was found on the East Coast and that's, completely misconstrues, the record in that regard for that item. So just make sure, you got proper documentation of what you found, and just, properly clean things too. I know I've seen people that don't know how to clean artifacts and they end up ruining them. And at that point, I feel like it's better off just left in the ground if you're not gonna, properly care for it. But that's
So
just some of the things that I think of.
So how do you properly clean something like, or is there some stuff that you don't clean simply because of its historical value and you don't want to possibly ruin it in some way?
Yeah, so there are definitely right and wrong ways to clean certain things. Obviously, with bullets, as long as you don't scrub that white patina off of it, you should be fine. Just a little bit of water and just kind of lightly brush it off. Some people just leave bullets as is, just kind of depends on the preference there. Um, but if you over clean or put them in certain chemicals, it will strip the normal white patina that you see on a uh, bullet. It'll just strip it down to its original gray state. And you don't want to do that because, part of what makes an artifact is the oxidation or patina on it. If you wanted it to look brand new, you should look into purchasing some non-dug artifacts because the excavated versus non-excavated is a big point of, the, what would you say, the context of it. You know what I mean? But with coat buttons, that's a big thing. Coat buttons that have gold or silver gilt or plating on them. Um, there are certain techniques as far as cleaning them that you would want to use for certain ones where you wouldn't for just bare brass. If you use, say, for example, I use lemon juice and water to clean buttons that have gilt on them, and it works really well. I mean, I can show you an example of a Vermont button that I dug that has almost all of the gold plating left on it, and then in the spots that it doesn't, the brass is still got patina on it, so that cleaned up very well. Whereas if you were to try to do that on something like a general service eagle button that doesn't have any gilt on it, you're just going to turn it red, and it's going to the acid is just too harsh for it. So you got to know definitely when to use certain techniques and when not to.
So, what are some of your more common finds? Like, what are some things that you found plenty of, and you know that there are plenty out there to find?
Biggest thing that you'll see anywhere is the standard three-ring mini ball used by the Union Army. They are, especially in this area, everywhere, and I do mean everywhere. I mean, you could find them in areas like where you would least expect it. There's at least one everywhere, um, but they're definitely the most common Civil War artifact that you see, and it's what you see a lot of in imagery of the Civil War when you see like you know artwork and statues and stuff and monuments. There's plenty of monuments that have mini balls as part of their design, but they are everywhere. That's the biggest thing. A lot of like the eagle coat buttons on the general service uniforms of Union enlisted men. Um, those are pretty prevalent. And then as far as getting into your bigger items, belt buckles, spurs, artillery shells, some of those things, those can get to be these days at least a little more harder to find. Whereas back in the day it might have been pretty common, but these days those are tough to come by.
So, speaking of, on those same lines, what are some of the more other rare items that you may have personally found, or that others have found? What are some like rare gems that are like just like breathtaking?
Yeah, pretty much anything Confederate is pretty rare. And that's just the nature of it. I mean, the Confederacy only existed, 4 to 5 years. So just by that rule alone, they only had time to make so much stuff. Uh, so there's only, so much of it in existence. And it's at a much smaller scale industrial wise, as opposed to, northern arsenals and firms that made things for uniforms and that sort of thing. I mean, they're just vastly outpaced. So your ratio of finding Union artifacts to Confederate is very, very contrasted, I would say, because I mean, you can find 10 Union bullets, if not more, for every one Confederate bullet, at a certain spot, unless you know exactly where to look to find a Confederate campsite or a Union campsite. But rarest things I've found, obviously my bread and butter artifact that I like to show everybody is my CS two-piece belt buckle, which I actually have here just to show if it'll pick up on camera. It's yeah, it's
Mhm.
reversed, but that is the standard Confederate cavalry belt buckle. Just two pieces clasped together, generally for a sword belt. But yeah, that's one of those ones that people in the community would consider to be a once in a lifetime find. Luckily for me, it was the first belt buckle I ever dug. I was 15 years old, and I found the tongue portion, the CS portion, and then a couple months later, we went back to that site. My dad found the wreath, and he gave it to me just to complete the buckle. So it's got some sentimental value to it for sure. Um, Aside from just being what it is, just because I found one half, Dad found the other. But things like that, certain coat buttons, um, those that don't know, a lot of almost every state in the Civil War had their own state seal on their uniform buttons. So certain ones are rarer than others. Your deep South states, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, Arkansas, those are probably the rarest Confederate states that you could find on a button. I've never seen any of those in person, but well, Texas I've seen in person, but Florida, Arkansas, Tennessee, you just don't see those. Those are incredibly rare. I know people that have found them, um, but things like that, those are just your bread and butter, belt buckles and coat buttons that are practically unheard of.
And with not giving away any locations or anything, but it would be really cool to see like a Florida button, up in Northern Virginia. Just to think about how far that thing has traveled, to get to from one spot to another. It's pretty awesome to consider.
I know
So
there are some, without giving away
yeah,
specifics. I do know that some have been found. I want to say that are in museums. So this is public information that have been found around Fredericksburg. So they have made their way up here and even further. I know of one found somebody found it on private property, of course, up near Gettysburg. So they've made their way pretty far up from where they first started. But it's super cool to just think of how they got here and it's a long way from home.
right. And again, not to give away anything, but what are some of the more um, neat places that you've traveled, like state-wise, to pursue this hobby? Because I assume that you haven't done just everything around Winchester. So what are some neat like areas that you've been to?
I've traveled as far west as Mississippi to detect. It's a long drive, and I don't know how often I would do that, but I've done it twice so far. Um, but yeah, I mean, depending on the site, what you're looking for, if you want to find something bad enough, um, go ahead. I will say it kind of helps if you travel a distance and go ask for permissions because the landowner's going to never expect to see you again after that one time that you're there. So you say, "Hey, I'm in town for, a day or two. What's the chances of doing a little detecting?" They're probably more likely to tell you yes. Or it could be the total opposite and they just say, "You're not from around here, get out of here." So, but I've had luck with it. But yeah, no, I've definitely traveled a fair ways, as far down as uh, how far south have I been? Probably down around Richmond. So not too far south, but definitely west. Well, gotta go south to get to Mississippi, but
Right.
westward at least. So yeah, I've been around a little bit.
And we are very fortunate to both live in Virginia, and the war happened all around us. So fortunately, we don't have to go too far to look for things if we ever wanted to venture out. It isn't like we have to travel across the country to find a Civil War site. For
Right.
for you, it's practically your backyard. Um,
That's what I always tell people is you can throw a rock in any direction and find a Civil War site around here. So it doesn't take a lot of skill. I mean, it does and it doesn't, but I mean, once you get the hang of it around here, it's pretty hard to not find something.
So to kind of wrap things up here, if I were to want to start pursuing this hobby today, like what's some advice that you would give me or anybody watching this like, who has thought about this in the past and now wants to take that leap forward and say, okay, this is something I'm going to do. Do you have any advice for people who are just starting out?
Yeah, of course, just like I said, treat landowners and the sites with respect. Make sure you've got permission to be where you're at. Know your laws. That's a good place to start, just so that way you're not going to get yourself in trouble before you ever really get started in the hobby. Um, Take the time to invest in good equipment. If you buy cheap equipment and cheap detectors, you probably won't find much because those cheap detectors, I hate to break it to you, probably won't dig very deep or deep enough to detect most Civil War artifacts. I mean, sometimes you do find stuff pretty shallow, but most of the time, your Civil War stuff is going to be sitting at about 6, 8 inches deep, or deeper. And a lot of times they are deeper. And if you don't have a detector that can pick that up, you're not going to find anything. So definitely invest in quality equipment. It is an investment because if you're going to be doing this hobby for a long time, um, it's worth it. But just make sure that you're patient. Don't get discouraged. There's many times where I've gone out. Spent an entire day detecting, come home exhausted, and don't find anything. And that's part of it. I mean, it's a process of elimination. You have to know where to look and where not to look. I mean, you could say, well, at least I tried, at least I looked, and at least I know there's nothing here. Um, or you can go back to that spot and just keep trying and eventually find something. I mean, it's just persistence and hard work, research, definitely research. Refer to your books, regimental histories, battle maps, uh, official records. There's all kinds of resources surrounding this stuff. I mean, it's very well documented. But luckily, there are some things that aren't so well documented, so you do have the chance of finding, a site that nobody knows about. There's plenty of campsites and things around here that people have, just kind of stumbled upon that would have otherwise gone, undocumented. But yeah, stay stay persistent and just don't get discouraged just because you have one or two bad outings or no luck to start. Because I mean, everybody that has a decent collection started out like that.
That's very awesome advice, just and to add to that, like everything you find is adding to the story a little more. Like you said that, if you pull out a a coat button, how important was that to the person who was wearing it? Like what's their story? You're being transported back into that time too. So, every little piece you find, no matter if it's, a few bullets here and there, like it's adding to the story, you know, at least some little bit.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I will say, you mentioned the coat buttons. Those more than anything, I think, are an incredible resource for, documenting who was where. When you're finding state seals, you look at battle maps and you see a certain state regiment one spot, and you find, a different state there that might, help correct errors on battle maps, or it might, dispute evidence one way or the other. Those are, the perfect markers on a battle site, to find out who was where. When you have the state on the button, it just tells you exactly where they were.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Elijah, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day to come talk with us about your hobby. If you guys are interested in this, I know that they do at least one Battlefields of Bourbon episode about this topic, and you dive into a bit more about what you found and the ways you found it. And we will link that below for everybody. We'll link the Battlefields of Bourbon Spotify and Apple Podcasts and YouTube below. As of right now, they have 41 episodes out, which is pretty awesome. Hopefully, some more here in the near future because us fans,
Hopefully,
yeah, us fans got got to get our fix on somehow. Um,
right?
well, and out of the 41 episodes, I could say at least 39 of them are great. I'm on two of them, so I won't count those in there as being great
No, those were
episodes.
good.
But
Those were
yeah,
good.
go check them out, support them. Elijah, again, thanks so much. And
Yeah, thanks for having me.
and we
I can talk about this stuff all day.
yeah, and we might have to get you back on if you land something awesome, But
Yeah,
um, like I said, thank you so much. And if you like this video, make sure you click the like button and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys later.
thanks, guys.